I want to ask you, is big data a bubble?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I think what we need to have is where do you want?
Wherever you want. Here, go there.
I think one of the things that we need to be is we need to start being judicious in how we think about data. I think the promise of data is incredibly powerful, but I think there's a lot of froth right now, and there's a lot of things that in the classic way of thinking about things versus product versus feature. I think there's a lot of features rather than direct products. And what I'd like to see is if people really get what I love, the things that I love are where data is a weapon by which you use to build a product. And at LinkedIn, for example, we were focused on a product. Data was by the weapon by how we compete.
Joined.
Sorry.
Right. Sir.
Hey. I found somebody I know. I was looking.
This is Amr Awadallah?
Awadallah. Yes.
The CTO of Cloudera. Well, because I say that because a couple months ago I wrote a piece called "Big Data is a Bubble, and That's a Good Thing." And I've been kind of lucky in my life. I've been through several bubbles. And for those who weren't here yesterday, Sharmila, Shahani-Mulligan is the head of ClearStory. And we'll talk about these companies in a moment. I said, it's a bubble, but most of the time, if you look at economic history, bubbles are based on something very real and very valuable. It's so new that the market doesn't really know how to price it. Like in 29, the mark stock is RCA. Radio is huge, radio is big, radio unites the country, radio is a great way to sell stuff, but how big is up? How high is up? And you overshoot, and then you come back down. And the bubble is the overshooting. The internet was a bubble in the late 90s, but don't tell me it's not relevant in the source of economic growth. So they give it a kind of infinite valuation. And then when it's merely huge, it crashes. Do you feel like we're there in big data, or is it just completely overhyped? And actually, this is a particularly good, since you're in the big data business, we won't go to completely overhyped, but describe your companies briefly, and we'll address that question and move into our next panel, which concerns understanding data skill needs for any organization. But I'll toss it to you first.
So let me take that. Because I think since they're building direct companies that are supporting the data layer, let me talk about what sits on top of that data layer in the bubble aspect there.
OK.
And I think one of the great ones that I think shows that there's a lot of room to still go in data and how people value it is a product called LinkedIn Skills. And this is designed by a guy named Pete Skomarok, who's one of the top data scientists in the world, in my opinion. And what Pete has done is, and his team have figured out, is that, hey, you know what? It's not just OK to define yourself as an individual. You have to say, what are your skills? But then think about a word like a rock. Is a rock a skill? It is to some people. It's also an experience to others. And so how do you start thinking about these things? But at the same time, if you say, hey, you know what? I want to hire Amr. I can't hire Amr. What does that mean? Is it because I like hanging out with Amr? I like the way we hang out? Or do I like him because of his skills and the skills at which he brings? And at the same time, being able to have a way of understanding who you want on a particular job or a task or whose help or advice you need, I think really comes down to that. And I still think that's such an early piece of the layer, just in particularly for the LinkedIn problem, that there's a lot of room to go.
OK, well, let's just refine the question a little bit then. As the chief data scientist at Greylock, you're talking to a lot of companies. You talk to people early in the development stage. Let's spend a minute, and I'd like you two to jump in. When you talk to the people you're addressing the most, you're probably on the technical side, and I assume you're the CEO and the marketing side most often. What sort of skills do they need to know? What sort of skills are they lacking? How well do they understand what they're getting into as they get into using data on a massive level?
Yeah, so before we jump into answering that question, if you can answer the previous question, which is what our companies do.
Yes.
I think
that was by way of introduction. And
yes.
then we'll move
Let's do the introductions first, and then we'll jump into the questions. So Cloudera, essentially, we are one of the first, if not the first, big data company. We were founded in October 2008. when the financial markets were collapsing at that time. And our mission really is to help companies to profit from all of their data. The idea is to give them a platform that allows them to store data of any type and run any type of computation. It could be simple queries or it could be more complex.
Perhaps a simple way to address the history is this took the Hadoop database, which took a lot of unstructured data, things like emails and click streams and stuff that didn't fit very well into traditional databases, and turned it into a kind of standard commercial product.
Yes. So Apache Hadoop sits at the heart of our offering, but it's not our entire offering. We have an offering called the Cloudera distribution, CDH for short, and there is 14 different projects in there, of which Hadoop is the core, it's the kernel. But just like with Linux and any other operating system, the kernel without the things around the kernel that make it functional is useless.
Okay.
So essentially, our company provides this full stack that allows you to collect data, store data, process data, and then serve data back to users. And it's the platform layer, not the application layer. So there's many companies like ClearStory here that focus more on the application layer. And very quickly, before I hand off to Sharmila, I would say maybe there is a bubble, maybe not. I'm not going to comment on that, but I can say from the big data perspective, we are at the beginning. Yeah. I mean, this is we're way at the beginning. This is going to be a huge wave.
You say that based on demand or because of the types of data that are entering the system, the type of sensors?
Based on what I'm seeing in terms of demand and how fast Cloudera has been growing over the last 3.5 years.
Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, when you talk to CTOs who are working with this, what sort of skills do they need that they didn't already possess?
Yeah, so I want to address that question, but maybe first, very quickly. Okay.
So quick introduction, ClearStory Data, we are allowing companies to pull together both private and public data so you can enrich your private data with public data off the web and various other sources. But more importantly, giving them an intuitive and easy front end to actually get this done and work with data that pulls from multiple sources. So as Amr said, we play higher up the stack. We're not a platform as such, but rather an engine that allows you to access data from multiple sources, multiple platforms, and data off the web, and give you a very intuitive way to actually go about running an analysis that crosses data sets. So what we really believe in is where big data needs to go with respect to the ease of use, the intuitiveness of being able to work with it, and not just allowing data scientists, data jocks to actually be able to get to the data they need when they need it, but rather letting your average business user be able to get to what they need to look at when they need to see it. So the ease of use and simplicity of the front end and how you work with data is a big focus of what ClearStory does. To answer your other question, Quentin, on the big data hype, and is the market overhyped? I'd say that the use of the term is way overhyped. I think that every company out there, regardless of if they have anything to do with really dealing with data problems or not, are associating themselves with big data and putting that label on themselves. And I think we need to clear through that mess. In fact, I think it's folks like yourself that, as you write about this space, should really sort of sift through who really is in the big data space and solving true big data problems versus those that are just applying the label to their company.
Well, what qualifies as a big data problem?
So what qualifies as a big data problem are companies that are truly actually working with the challenges of dealing with data at scale, dealing with the complexity of analysis when you are dealing with data at scale, working with data from multiple different sources and a variety of different data types. Unstructured, of course, is sort of the next big frontier, which is what's driven a lot of Cloudera's growth. But that's a bulk of where the new data comes from and the nature of the new data. So if you're truly solving the complexity of dealing with that type of data coming from these type of sources and giving people easier ways to work with it and access it, yeah, that qualifies as a big data company. If what you're doing is building an application where, somewhere on the side there you've got a data problem that's not necessarily a big data company. Your business is that application and what that application's purpose is. So you see a lot of companies that are out sort of trying to basically identify where the product market fit is with respect to the applications. And in the process of trying to get there, they tend to slap on the big data label but it's not necessarily a big data company. And so I think that we've got a slightly messy situation today where the market is not well defined in terms of who truly is solving big data problems and what it really means, but rather we've got this wave going on of lots of startups associating themselves with it while they're on their way to trying to figure out what they really are all about.
In some sense, a lot of big data is a comment on storage.
Right.
Boy, we sure have a lot of random information here of SCSI provenance.
Right.
Yeah. And it's not about size. Like if I might offer my take on it, I mean, big data, the litmus paper test for me is the three Vs kind of moniker that we have been hearing a lot these days, which is essentially variety, velocity, and volume. Mm-hmm. If you meet all the three Vs, then you are a big data company, in my opinion. With focus specifically on the velocity.
Say a bit more about variety as well. By variety, you mean sort of non-standard relationships?
Yeah, by variety. So I'll cover each one very briefly. So variety essentially means that it's not just relational data. It's not just very well defined, pre-prescribed columns and relationships across tables. Variety means it could be XML, it could be JSON, it could be flat text, it could be comma delimited, space delimited, images, videos, it could be whatever. Mm-hmm. That's really what variety means. It's data that comes in any shape or form at you. And then velocity, which is really for me is the foundational kind of difference here. Velocity is the ability to adapt in a very agile way with how the data is growing and how the data is changing at the same time. So growth meaning the ability to scale the system up and by just adding more servers without having to go and redesign all of our algorithms, re-index all of our databases. We just throw more servers and we grow as the data grows. And velocity is also dealing with change. So our data is not static, right? So relational databases are prescriptive in nature. They prescribe to you, this is our schema. If you don't meet our schema, you're not getting inside our database. Mm-hmm. Versus Hadoop-like systems and big data systems are descriptive in nature. They give you a description of what you can, but you can be outside the description. We still allow you to come in, and then later on you can amend the description.
If you dwell
it's
on
not
that,
imposed on you.
If you dwell on that a little bit, both metaphorically and in a very real world, you're changing the shape and function of organizations pretty radically with that, because you're talking about this world of where data identity, but also roles and jobs and skills are kind of contingent at all times. The relationship can change. The data can be matched with other data. The team might reflect that. You need to take in some new skill. Some other guy can go work elsewhere.
Yes.
You need to bring somebody else in to explain things.
Yes.
So,
like we say, there's another V now that we're starting to throw around, which is value. Is that a big part of this movement, of the big data movement, is realizing that data is no longer this thing that feeds into the CFO office for a report. Right? It's going beyond that. No, data is an asset that your company should leverage in a new way.
Well, that's sort of the governor on a bubble. If it's returning more on its investment, it's not a bubble. It's a profitable endeavor. But how do you sort that out? How do you know what valuable data is?
I think it's so there's big challenge here, and I think one of the things of exactly along that three Vs is part of it is. Once you've established that layer, one of the things I think that we are still quite far from is what do you really build on top of it? Like where that value proposition.
Say more about that.
So for example, building the people you may knows, building those recommendation engines. Those are still very much in their infancy. And the reason why is the types of signal that you can get in. Just if we even just go back a few years, I mean, it was really actually the advent of Hadoop that really enabled a lot of this to happen. One of the quick analogies is when we were building people we may know, we tried it. It started on Oracle. Then we tried it on nearly every system, and then we'd get 6 months out of every system. Finally, we kind of at wit's end, we finally really adopted Hadoop to do it.
Was there a common thread in why the Oracle would fail or why other systems would fail?
They're just the wrong tool for it. It's kind of spanners versus Phillips screwdriver, and it's for that type of problem.
Again, it goes back to the agility, the ability to deal with change, with data that's evolving all the time. New columns, new attributes are being added all the time. It's not fixed.
And a lot of times, you're not just doing just a traditional machine learning algorithm on top of this. You're putting a lot of heuristics and trying to just be really clever with the model.
And so
it's a speed of how you actually iterate and adapt on top of that product. Just like you might just throw a whole bunch of code and try stuff out, The same way, you can now start to do that. You can interact with the data rather than having to wait for it sitting some way off.
But when you get to an application level, you're talking about where it meets the broadest group of people.
That's right.
And this can be very confusing. How do people even know how to ask the right questions of the data?
Right. So, you know, like for some of you who were here yesterday, you know, the way we come at it is and answer the question of what data is valuable is by actually starting with the question. So if you have a business question and it is a question that requires a quick answer because it improves the business or it improves sales or solves a business problem, the data that's behind that's required to answer the question is the valuable data.
But
right?
do they know what that data is?
And they don't always know what that data is, but they have a hunch of what they'd like to see. They may not necessarily know what the right sources are to go to answer that question. They know what they want to see. They know the components of it, but they may not always know the source. Now, when you're dealing with a business user who has to solve a business problem, because they are living in a different side of the organization than IT that controls the data sources, they may not always know the specifics around where that data lives and how it's stored and where it's stored. But they do know in general that, you know, it's either inside the organization or it's outside the organization, and I need to get to it. And so that's basically one of the big frontiers, I think, of big data is the ability for people to get to the sources that they need to get to faster and be able to get to answers by doing it themselves versus always having a reliance on data scientists or data architects. I think one of the most interesting things happening in the big data market, too, is that the back-end complexity continues to grow. As Amr said, the volume of it will continue to explode. The variety will continue to get more complex. The velocity, which is the rate of change of data, will continue to reach, you know, levels that we didn't imagine before, where it's constantly changing. So the three V's at the back continue to get very complex, but the user expectations on the front end we're at a point where people are thirsting for more simplicity. And it's largely driven, of course, by a lot of what's happened in the consumer space and a lot of the devices, et cetera, that we're used to today. But people have a big appetite and expectation on simplicity at the front end. And so we've got this widening gap between the complexity of the data on the back end and the scale of the data at the back end versus user expectations on how they should be able to work with it with respect to simplicity and intuitiveness.
Well, how do you arrive at simplicity? Is that a question of a minimum number of key data sets? Is that great visualization? Is that knowing how to ask the right question of your data?
I mean, that's where the innovation is going to
right.
come. I mean, that's where the innovation is going to come, is reaching to that point. Like, I'll say the old way of, I don't want to say the old way, but the previous wave of doing things is the questions were predefined ahead of time, right? And that's a fundamental shift here. Meaning,
say more about that.
Meaning, we knew what the questions we were going to ask. We knew the known unknowns. We knew that we wanted to see how many users I got last week.
Right. How many people have made a reservation to fly from New York?
Well, let's put it in context historically. Like historically, you know, 7 years ago, for the first time, systems were being opened up for general use, where even people could touch the data without somebody having to say, I want to see this, right? I want to know this, which is some sort of very MBA-esque question, right? And one of the first organizations to ever open that up was actually Amr's organization at Yahoo, right? Then what happened is LinkedIn and Facebook took it to the next level and said, you know what, we're going to completely democratize the data. We are going to completely open it up where anybody in the organization is allowed to touch it. And the only way we're able to do that is really through systems like Hadoop. What's happening now is we have this dichotomy where, yes, there is a set of organizations that have the ability to have extraordinary democratization, and then you have the classic problem, well, I pulled it this way, and you pulled it this way. Why are our numbers doing different things? We have another set of organizations where they still can't unlock the data. In that mix, as people know they start to have to transition to this area of democratization, there is ample room for products to come in to say, here's how to simplify. Here's how to make your life easier than having to absorb all this overhead of learning and trying to understand where data is and how to manipulate it.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I say we are still way at the beginning of this wave. Like, if you look at Oracle as the previous wave, like Oracle, in the first 10 years, it was all about the database, the platform, and SQL. And that was the only way to work with it, right? But then there was this flourishing kind of ecosystem that was built of applications that make the platform significantly more accessible for CRM, for financials, for business intelligence, et cetera, we're going to see the exact same thing happen here.
But one of the things about the future, no matter how revolutionary it is, it still shows up consisting mostly of the past. You got legacy technologies, you got old line businesses that do things in conventional ways, you have a huge weight of the economy. And it's very easy to talk about the revolutionary new approaches when you have small startup companies, because you can pivot, you can change, you hire people who are flexible by nature. That isn't most of the world. How does this kind of approach graft into the existing economy?
Yeah, I think you can't approach big data problems today without fully acknowledging the last 30 years of what the data that's accumulated in the legacy repositories. The bottom line is that that is basically the heartbeat of a lot of businesses today. And they will continue, those repositories will continue, and they'll continue to grow in size. We'll be adding to that a lot of other new repositories and platforms, particularly things like Hadoop, because of the nature of today's data versus the nature of everything being structured in the last couple decades. But you can't ignore the last couple decades of what has existed and what's grown within corporations. And when you solve a big data problem, I mean, granted, depending on what aspect of it you're trying to solve, you have to be able to take into account where the wealth of data already exists in most organizations and bring that into the mix, along with introducing to organizations some of the new platforms and new places to store data.
And all three of, sorry, go ahead.
But I think that, so absolutely, I think acknowledging the last couple decades and always making sure that one understands that that data is not going to go away. There's not going to be this massive movement of all of that data being removed from those systems into new platforms. They can continue to live where they've lived.
That's the source
right?
of cash flow.
Exactly, right. So, but introduced into that are a lot of new platforms which then allow people, which actually opens the opportunity to give users a new way of working with data across all these different sources. So it's the new platforms like Hadoop and other platforms that are sources of new data types and unstructured data that is really opening the door.
So there's other platforms?
Just one here and there, that allow people to, are opening people's minds to new ways of actually working with it, right? So we've opened the door to getting business users and IT to actually accept and be willing to look at new ways to work with it as they embrace some of these other platforms within the organization, but you cannot ignore the old.
When you sorry, go ahead.
On the same topic, and with any new wave of technology, I mean, this one is not any different. You have three things that need to fall into place for that technology to succeed, right? And it's within Cloudera's strategy to make sure that we do these three things. The first one is to make sure there is an educated talent source out there that knows how to use this new technology. So Cloudera has a very big training business. Last year, we trained 10,000 people across the whole world.
Good job.
This year, we're training about 1,500 people every month. And the business is ramping up very quickly because we know that's foundational.
What is it you train them in?
We train them on this new skill set, how to deal with unstructured data, how to deal with data that has a schema that's changing all the time, and how to work with this holistic new stack.
I presume you're doing that with online tutorials.
Some of it is online, some of it is
in fact, if you go to any of the, there's plenty of courses here, even at Berkeley.
Yeah,
sure.
Like Jeff Hammerbecker, my co-founder.
That's to bring up a new generation of people who are comfortable in this, and data scientists get hired right out of college.
Yes, exactly. And we'll get there. So again, with I mean, just like Java, when Java came out, you had some time before you were able to get the pool of talent out there that knows how to work with it. So number one is education, which has been ramping up very, very quickly. And then number two is accessibility, right? Which goes back to we need to make sure that this system and this new wave of innovation and this new technology works with the previous wave. Otherwise, because that's where the data is. Big chunks of data are in the previous systems, and they want to be fed. They want to feed, and they want to be fed from this source. So number two is definitely making sure we can integrate with the existing systems. And then number three is applications like ClearStory that make it much more accessible to a wider gene pool, right? Not just the developers. It can be accessible to the business users as well.
I was going to add a fourth, which is, I think, very powerful, which is I think there's also going to be a lot of augmentation with additional data, where the data that you have is not going to be there. And you can see Gil's back there. Actually, I think he's up next.
Gil's up next.
Yeah, and so I won't go into the large part, but I think that's like those services where somebody else keeps the master set and ensures a quality specification, particularly around geo and other things. I think will become increasingly beneficial because that overhead to manage those systems is too heavy. Just like we're commoditizing, it's like, hey, you know what? You need CDH. Well, okay, where are you going to put CDH? Oh, fine. You're going to put it in Rackspace or Amazon or your own space. Who cares? It's your choice. We're going to get that flexibility, and that flexibility is what's going to also allow the migration of legacy into other paradigms.
Well, when you talk to large incumbents, what are the most intelligent, I'll put it two ways. What are the most intelligent questions they ask about getting started? And what are times you think, this guy's clueless or he's been deceived by a bunch of hype? Cut it in two directions.
Yeah. So you always have to boil it down to what business problem they're trying to solve. Like if there's no, just with any technology innovation, if that technology is not solving a real problem, then it's useless, right? We build technology to solve problems, not the other way around. We don't build technology to find problems we can solve with. The problem has to drive the technology. So always the first conversation we have whenever we go to any large existing enterprise is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And sometimes they actually pay us to come in and help them find what the problem is.
This circles back to what Sharmila was saying as well.
Yeah. So sometimes
it calls on them to know themselves rather well.
Yes.
That's the difference between clueless and clued.
Yeah.
I suppose.
So that's exactly. So that is the litmus paper test. It's like, are you just excited by the hype, or do you actually really have something that can benefit?
So
from this? And we help them with that.
From our side, there are really two things we see. We primarily deal with line of business, and so typically if they're talking to us, it's because they already have a burning problem, right? But the problem falls into two areas. Either it's a situation where they just can't get to the answer because they need to get to more data of different types from different places to get to the answer, and that's what they're trying to solve for. Or it's just a speed issue, in that they have been able to get to the answer. It's just taking 3 times longer than it should.
This is like that old joke: if you're talking to me, it must be bad.
That's right. So it's not always the case where they don't know what the answer is and haven't been able to get to the answer. It's often the case where the pain is that they've had to wait weeks or months and depend on people in IT and the back room, data scientists that they can't get to that easily, to actually get to it. So we're trying to solve here in this new wave here, not just the richness of insight by allowing them to get to more data and get data out of environments like Cloudera, et cetera, but also the speed at which they can do this.
Yeah, time to insight.
And the time to insight aspect of this is absolutely one of the biggest things that we need to solve for in this market, and it's obviously driven by the way the world works these days, right? It's, people need to have an answer, and they need to have it now, and they don't want to wait 3 weeks. They don't want to have a dependency on a group of people that may say, look, we can get this to you, but we'll turn it around in about 5 weeks, right? Yeah. So we need to solve for the ease of use aspect that I talked about earlier, and the simplicity is not just about the analysis and the data itself, but part of simplicity is the speed element. And so that's a lot of, let's say, where a lot of the innovation lies is getting over some of the latency that exists in the businesses today.
I'd like to enter 5 weeks used to be nothing.
It used to be nothing.
We're like a nation that paces in front of a microwave.
And there's no tolerance for it today, right?
Yeah. I'd like to answer it a different way, which is the organizations that I feel are answering the right way is because they have some group of people that have already bubbled up in the organization and said, you know what, why the hell aren't we doing this way? Why aren't we doing this way? And I can tell you, whether you take the federal sector in healthcare, the HHS, or even in national security, the right types of people are saying, you know what, we have to have Hadoop, or I have to have the streaming engine, or I have to have it this way. And in most organizations where you have this kind of classic, like, hey, we have to have this answered this way, or we want it, packaged in this way, they always ask, we can't find the people to do it. And I'll go into this organization, I'll meet with them, and I'll say, what are you talking about?
You have many of
You already have them. You just have them forced doing this crappy stuff that they don't want, and they don't have the bandwidth to do it.
You're so busy making them unhappy.
Exactly. Just empower them to do it, and they'll figure out what right technologies to pick.
Fair enough. Now, it's interesting, in as much as we're talking about this S-curve from art and discovery through science, engineering, manufacturing, mass use. The problems you're identifying are not, we need more mathematicians. The problems you're identifying in some ways are management problems.
Oh, yeah.
It's across the board. I mean, yeah, there is definitely management and DNA of the company itself.
But you need mathematicians, clearly. We can find them,
but,
we can produce them, we can buy them from
we need
other
a change
countries.
to that. I mean, that's where the data scientist kind of moniker comes from, is we need a new type of statistician that knows how to go all the way. They know how to work at the statistics level and data mining level, but they know how to go all the way to the data, the cleansing of the data, the collection of the data. That's really what a data scientist is somebody who can span that whole spectrum and bring value at the end. That's the missing skill.
The nature of broad intelligence is to create a kind of ecosystem view, which destroys categories. But so you're talking about that happening inside people as well. The data scientist is a social scientist in that sense, or
They're storytellers.
The manager is a mathematician?
They're storytellers. The best data scientists I've ever worked with are unbelievable storytellers.
Do you think this is an innate human thing, though? Don't people play to a certain skill set? Can people broadly become this broad?
Yeah. It's a skill you can learn. It's a skill.
I think it's story. People don't realize I remember this story actually with you, Quinn. I gave a talk, and you saw the talk, and you're like, hey, you know what? You should really reorganize it and talk about it this way because you're not telling a story. And you were dead on. And part of what I went away and realized about this was like, oh, wait a second. You know what? I'm not thinking about this even myself as much as how I need to think about this as storytelling. Right. And one of the things that we did actually after you and I had this conversation, which I think was about 2 years ago, was we went back to the team, and actually a lot of us went through Ira Glass, who's he has this kind of talk on what it takes to do storytelling. Yeah. And we went through that, and we sort of said, okay, if we were to take a pure narrator, journalistic approach to talking about data, what would we be able to say? Would we be able to communicate better? That comes from everything from the graphs to the way you frame the problem to the way you educate others. Well, and it makes a big difference.
Not to make things seem joyless, but good storytelling is a kind of data compression.
Yeah.
With an emotional dimension that keeps people engaged.
What can you take out of this data presentation?
Well, and what will lead you? What does it do that leads you to ask other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I think to add to Amr's point on the value of the statistician, I'd say that one of the things that is happening here is the point of handoff is changing. So we're still at a phase where there's a huge reliance on the data scientists and the statistician and the mathematician. But what we're trying to do here is basically within that data pipeline where you've got the data at the back end and the delivery of the answer to the user on the front end, we need to basically change the point of handoff. Mm-hmm. So you'll still need the statisticians and the data scientists on the back end who are masters of the data itself, but we need to build solutions that allow that handoff to happen at an earlier point so that there are more people on the front end that can actually take it over and be more independent. Yeah,
so it's not an either or. It's not an either or.
And it's not an either or. And I think we tend to talk about this as if we need to basically make a decision on whether we're moving the power to the people at the business level or keeping the power with the data scientists. It's not an either or at all. Both needs exist. It's just a question of how far up can this handoff happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of us in this area who are innovating in this area basically trying to make it possible for that handoff to happen at an earlier point. Mm-hmm. Because we do understand that there are just going to be not as many people on the back end of it, and they're going to continue to be burdened with a lot of tasks to do, and they have to be able to hand it off at an earlier point to the rest of the organization where there are more numbers.
And this is probably a good time to make note of something a emerging PhD in data science made yesterday. It sounds a little bit like we're handing out free lunch tickets. Everybody's going to be a data scientist now. And that's not true.
And that's not
inside the back end, the math is deeper and harder than ever before in order to make things accessible.
That's right.
I actually like to think of it
just
the
like
other
with
way.
Oracle. Again, Oracle, you have the higher level apps, but you still have people going and doing SQL against Oracle directly. You're going to have both. You're going to have both.
So I think of it actually slightly differently, which is I think of data science as a trait, rather than that you certainly could say, like, so great, I'm a mathematician. OK, I think of it as a trait. Am I a product guy first, or am I a mathematician first? I think of myself as a product guy. Some of my best product guys are data scientists. I would argue that Jeff Weiner, the CEO of LinkedIn, is a data scientist. Reed Hastings of Netflix personally tweaks the algorithm for the recommendations. He's a data scientist. Bill Campbell at Intuit, he was a data scientist because the way he approached at using data to navigate the competitive landscape. Now, it's just like you say, oh, are you a marketer, or do you use marketing as your weapon to compete on things? Data is by the way in which you compete against others and use data to make yourself better by evolving.
So do we have time to take questions from the audience? Or
We have questions from the audience?
That'd be great.
Sir.
So what tools are we building to enable data scientists to do their jobs better? If you're saying it's going to be both supporting business analysts and data scientists, what are we building to help them?
What tools are we building that enable data scientists?
The latest CDH.
I mean, within CDH, within CDH, I mean, the whole platform is I mean, really to help a data scientist extract value from data.
For the lay people in the room, define CDH.
Yeah, so I mean, CDH is essentially a data operating system. Right? That's how I refer to it.
Okay.
That you install on many, many, many servers, and it gives you the ability to collect data scalably, store the data, process the data, and convert it from its original unstructured form to a form you can actually extract value from, and then finally serve that value to end users. That's what CDH is. And we continue to enrich the system with more and more functionality that speak directly to data scientists. So for example, Mahout now is part of CDH. Mahout is a prepackaged library of many of the most popular data mining algorithms implemented in MapReduce. So you don't have to go and re-implement them. You can just run them right away. Another very good partnership that speaks to data scientists is the one we have with Revolution R. Revolution R, they commercialized the R open source data mining platform. And R now has an implementation that runs directly on top of Hadoop. So the same R programming language that statisticians are used to, they use the same language, but now it gets pushed out and leverages the parallelism and the agility that you get from the Hadoop platform. So these are just some examples. And we continue to do more. Again, we're just at the beginning.
Can I just identify the gaps?
Sure.
So I think the big gaps are what Amr's talking about is incredibly important, but it's still got a long way to go. I think it needs to look more like a MATLAB or a Mathematica environment where it's interpretive and very quick. It's very snappy. Because you frame the questions very differently as you do that. The second is visualization. Visualization layers still are nowhere near they need to be. And the overall process end-to-end is still far too brittle. It's not as dynamic range that it needs to. And as those products evolve, and there's plenty of room for new in this area.
Yeah, lots of them.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
I'd also add that as we talk about going higher up the data pipeline and making it easier, in order to do that, we actually depend on a lot of these innovations and developments on the back end. So things like Mahout, at my last company, Astrodata, doing things like SQL MapReduce, where we married MapReduce with SQL. You're interfacing and depending on those type of frameworks in order to make the top end of the stack simpler. So both of these things are moving in parallel, and one can't happen without the other. So it's not a case where a lot of the investment is how do you make it easy on the front end? In order to make it easy on the front end, you have to be able to see the development of these type of frameworks on the back end. So these analytic libraries that are coming out of companies like Cloudera that are built on top of MapReduce are very critical to what a lot of other companies are trying to do with respect to solving the ease of use problem.
Yes, sir.
So I have a question regarding simplicity and ease of use, and it's already been touched upon a little bit, specifically with data visualization. I'm wondering what can we expect, some of your predictions in the field of data visualization, and also to that point, is data visualization too narrow? Are we only using one sense? Do we need to be using other senses to really incorporate what it is data interpretation?
I might add the gentleman in the third row will be speaking on visualization later. So
Yeah.
But
I was going to defer that. That's why. My just quick 2 cents are data viz is just too hard still. There's not a great generic. D3 is fantastic, but it's still too heavy, too hard to use. We need an interactive layer where it's just very easy to manipulate. And the data, when you put data in data viz, it requires too much artistic design still. It's not easy. I wonder oftentimes why people don't make their dashboards look a little bit more like an infographic. Not totally overboard on infographic, but slightly, because then people would actually, in a company, would look at it.
Yeah, I think one of the other areas of data visualization is making sure that we actually convey to users how many dimensions of data make sense to look at together and where it reaches a point where it's too complex. And I think DJ touched on this earlier in his talk, but there's a level at which you're not going to be able to look at 6 or 7 dimensions and make any sense of it. And so as you're serving up data from at scale and a lot of variety of data to users, when it comes to the visualization aspect, it's the job of the products in these solutions to tell the user what makes sense and at what point things are getting too complex. Because if you leave it too open-ended, you're going to allow the user to jam together too much in a single visualization, and it's going to be impossible to make any sense of it.
Right, they're flipping 6
So a lot of the innovation in visualization, as everyone knows, many ways you can visualize data when there's 2 dimensions. We also know many ways to visualize data when there's 3 dimensions. When you get into 4 dimensions or 5 dimensions or 6 dimensions, which is essentially the limit, what are the right visualizations where it's still intuitive and you can actually get value out of it versus becoming almost like mind-boggling and useless. So that's a lot of where sort of the new areas of development are, is how do you display things when you get to 4 or 5 dimensions. And then when it comes to the simpler things, like 2 or 3 dimensions, we're now in a world where we can actually do things that are more interesting looking and more interesting visualizations, but they're not necessarily groundbreaking new things. They're just more interesting ways to display data.
Yeah, no, I would add what DJ said earlier, which is it's really about telling the story. That's what you want to get at. The best way you can tell the story. I wouldn't go beyond just the visual sense right now. To answer your question about going beyond that, I think we have ways to go just to cover the visual sense, and I guess the cognition that comes from that. I would stress that one, and give a plug for one of our partners, Tableau. Tableau is one of the leading visualization companies out there, and their key secret is actually not the visualizations themselves. It's how to make it easy for us to get to the visualization we care about, how to program visualizations. And I think that's where lots of innovation needs to happen in the market going forward.
Yeah, and I also agree with your point is the notion of visualization needs to change. So I think it actually carries certain connotations from the past, driven largely by the last generation of BI tools. And most of that is people think of it as visualizations having once developed or presented, that's what you've got. But rather what we need to convey is the dynamic nature of what those can be and the ability to manipulate those once a result is already presented. So we are, when you talk to a lot of users and customers and you talk about visualization, the immediate thing that comes to mind is what they know about visualizations from the last generation of BI tools, and things are going to look very different, 5, 10 years from now, from a standpoint of what this really means. So I think the notion of visualization really needs to change, and we need a lot more education on how to actually interpret and what that should be and get people out of the old way of thinking.
I think that'll have to be our last question, please.
DJ, you were talking about storytelling earlier, and I imagine a lot of those stories go company-wide and product-wide. Can you talk a little bit about data science teams? Maybe a couple of words about that.
So I guess for those that are interested, we wrote a free book with O'Reilly. It's on Amazon. If you just search for my name on Amazon, you can get it. I think the biggest thing I would say about building data science teams is what style of organization you have. Are you product driven? Are you engineering driven? The one advice I would have for you, which was the advice I took in building, sort of getting LinkedIn's team to the next level, was I went to Yahoo, I went to eBay, I went to Google, I went to HP, and I talked to every single data science organization I could to see what worked and what didn't work, and then structured it as such. And we took the model of saying that there has to be a Spock on the bridge. There has to be somebody up there. And because LinkedIn was a product-driven organization, we said, let's put that person up there. In Yahoo's case, they had a couple different models in there over time, which they did, which I thought were extremely insightful to do that. And then the third thing that we did was we created an advisory group. Cloudera was one of our earliest customers, or we were one of their early customers, I should say. And we were able to work very collaboratively together. And as part of that, I was fortunate enough to get a lot of fantastic input and advice from Amr, from Hammerbacher, from Mike Olson about, hey, does this feel right or not right, or how can we iterate to the next level? And I think because it's such an early space, I would just encourage everyone as you're trying to think about, if you are building a data science team or thinking about a data science team, don't go for what the status quo is now. Look at the status quo and ask yourself, great, that's what the lessons are learned. What should I do to evolve this to the next tier? Because we know there's so much room for things to get better, to take the lessons that we have and do better. I don't know if you were one of the key guys I talked to get advice, and people don't always realize this. That you built one of the biggest and one of the most powerful data science organizations early on.
Thank you. Yeah, they spread. They went everywhere.
They went. I hired a lot of them.
Yes. You're making the standard. Well, I'm sorry that's all we have time for, but I think you'll all be around for a little bit, and we'll have a break after I speak with Gil. Maybe people can ask you a few more questions if they want. For now, let's give our panel a big hand.
Thank you, sir.